started on an ordinary Sunday morning. Grandpa had called my dad and me over to his house to help him with some repairs in the basement. The old man had lived alone for as long as I could remember, in the creaky Victorian house at the edge of the woods. It was the type of place that could have been plucked straight out of a Gothic novel, with ivy crawling up its weathered stone walls and a cellar door that always seemed to groan in protest whenever opened. We arrived at his place just past 9. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, mingling with the lingering scent of coffee Grandpa had brewed for us. He greeted us at the door, his wiry frame and mischievous grin as familiar as ever. But there was something else in his expression that day, attention he tried and failed to hide. "Morning, you two," he said, ushering us inside. "We've got a problem downstairs. Think you can give me a hand?" I followed behind, carrying a toolbox while Dad made small talk. As we descended into the basement, the atmosphere shifted. The musty air grew heavier, and the faint hum of the boiler seemed louder than usual. The dim light cast long shadows across the room, making the cobwebs glisten like threads of silver. "It's the foundation," Grandpa explained, pointing to a corner where the concrete had cracked. I thought it was just the house settling, but I noticed a draft coming through. Could be something worse. Dad crouched to inspect the crack. I hung back, my attention wandering to the far end of the basement where old furniture and dusty boxes were stacked. That S when I saw it, a corner of fabric poking out from beneath a tarp. "Grandpa, what's this?" I asked, walking over to the pile. His face paled. "Leave it, Mark," he said sharply. But it was too late. My curiosity had already taken over. I pulled back the tarp, revealing a tattered coat covering what appeared to be a bundle of blankets. But as I leaned closer, a nauseating smell hit me, the unmistakable stench of decay. I froze, staring at the lifeless face partially hidden by the folds of fabric. Empty eyes stared back at me, sockets rimmed with shadows, the skin taut and discolored. "What the hell?" Dad's voice was a mixture of shock and anger. He turned to Grandpa, whose trembling hands gripped the railing of the stairs. "I don't understand," Grandpa stammered. "Who is that? What's it doing here? What wasn't he supposed to happen?" Dad's voice rose, panic seeping into his words. "Why is there a body in your basement?" Grandpa collapsed onto a nearby chair, his face ashen. "I don't understand," he stammered. "What is that? What happened here?" The story that followed unraveled years of family secrets. Decades ago, during a particularly harsh winter, a stranger had shown up at the house. He was disheveled, desperate, and looking for shelter. Grandpa, then a much younger man with a family to protect, had reluctantly let the man stay for the night. He was trouble from the start, Grandpa said, his voice cracking. Kept asking questions, wondering where he shouldn't be. I tried to get him to leave the next morning, but he refused. When I caught him trying to break into the pantry, I lost it. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of his confession visibly crushing him. "I didn't mean to kill him. It was an accident." He fell, hit his head. Panicked. "So you buried him in the basement?" Dad's voice was thick with disbelief. Grandpa shook his head, his confusion apparent. "I don't know who that is or how they got here. I've never seen them before." For a long moment, the room was silent, save for the faint drip of a leaky pipe. The horror of what we'd uncovered seemed to seep into the very walls of the house. "We have to call the police," Dad said finally. "You know that, right?" Grandpa's eyes widened in terror. "No, please, Frank, don't do that. I'm an old man now. What good would it do?" Dad's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. "This isn't something we can just ignore. It's a crime." Couldn't he speak? My mind raced with questions, with fear. How had Grandpa lived with this for so long? And what did this mean for us? For our family? Before Dad could make a move, the light overhead flickered. A gust of cold air swept through the basement, extinguishing the small lamp on the workbench. On the far wall, where the dust had been disturbed, faint letters became visible as if scrawled with a trembling hand. "Leave them here." The darkness seemed alive, pressing in on us from all sides. Then we heard it. A low groan, guttural and inhuman, coming from the direction of the tarp. My blood ran cold. I turned slowly, my heart pounding as the bundle beneath the tarp began to shift. "It's not possible," Grandpa whispered, clutching his chest. I remember now the house, it was built over an old graveyard. The neighbors, they warned me when I first moved in, told me stories about strange things happening in the area. The thing beneath the tarp moved again, this time sitting up. The fabric fell away, revealing the corpse, its head lolling to one side, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Its milky eyes locked onto Grandpa, and in a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, it spoke. "You thought you could bury me," Grandpa screamed, clutching his chest as he fell to the floor. The walls of the basement trembled as the sound of splintering would echoed like a thunderclap. I barely had time to react before the tarp flew into the air, revealing a figure that defied all logic, its limbs grotesquely elongated, its skeletal frame adorned with scraps of tattered cloth. The smell of rot was overpowering as the figure dragged itself upright, its milky eyes fixed on me now. The air turned frigid, each breath a plume of white mist. From the walls, faint whispers began to rise, a chorus of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand, growing louder, angrier. Dad grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the stairs, but the figure blocked our path. It didn't walk. It glided forward, its mouth opening wide to release an ear-splitting screech that made my vision blur. "This house is cursed," Grandpa choked out, gasping for air. "You have to leave. Both of you." The figure lunged, its bony fingers outstretched as if to grab me. I stumbled backward into the workbench, my heart hammering in my chest. My hand closed around a rusted wrench, and with every ounce of strength, I swung it wildly. The impact landed on its skeletal arm, shattering it like brittle glass. A high-pitched shriek erupted from the creature, its form contorting as it recoiled. But it didn't retreat for long. The whispers around us grew louder, now filled with rage, as the creature's shattered limbs seemed to regenerate before my eyes. Dad grabbed a broken table leg and swung it, driving the creature back momentarily. "Keep moving," he shouted, his voice trembling but firm. I grabbed a nearby flashlight, flicking it on and aiming the beam directly at the creature. To my astonishment, it recoiled further, its skin-like tissue blistering under the light. "The light! It hates the light!" I yelled, shining it into its face as Dad scrambled to pull Grandpa closer to the stairs. The creature hissed, shielding its face, but it began to move faster, slithering unnaturally across the floor as if propelled by some unseen force. I swung the wrench again, connecting with its torso, but it felt like hitting air. A cold gust blew past me, and I realized with horror that it wasn't just one entity. Any more shadows began to emerge from the corners of the room, twisting and writhing into humanoid shapes with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. "There's too many," Dad shouted, now halfway up the stairs with Grandpa. "Mark, come on." The flashlight flickered, and panic surged through me. I grabbed a lantern from the workbench, fumbling to light it as one of the shadow figures lunged. Its icy grip closed around my wrist, sending a jolt of pain through my arm. With a desperate cry, I smashed the lantern into the floor, the burst of flames forcing the shadows to retreat. The light illuminated the scrawled words on the wall again. "Leave them here." My heart sank as the realization struck me: the house didn't want us to leave. It wanted us to stay. "Mark," Dad's voice jolted me from my thoughts. I snatched the wrench and flashlight, bolting up the stairs as the flames began to die out. The shadows screamed in unison, their anguished cries echoing through the basement as we slammed the door shut behind us. Dad hoisted Grandpa onto his shoulder, and we bolted up the stairs, the whispers rising into a deafening roar. We slammed the basement door shut behind us, the wood splintering under an unseen force that pounded against it. Outside, the house seemed alive, the windows rattling, the walls creaking as if trying to trap us within. We ran to the car, leaving everything behind. As we sped away, I looked back at the house. For a moment, I thought I saw the figure standing in the upstairs window, its grotesque grin illuminated by the flickering light inside. But it wasn't over. A mile down the road, the headlights began to flicker, and the engine sputtered. Dad cursed under his breath, pulling the car to the shoulder. The air outside was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain for any sound. From the shadows of the trees lining the road, movement caught my eye. Figures emerged tall, impossibly thin, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The same guttural groaning we heard in the basement echoed through the night, growing louder with each step they took toward us. "Get out of the car," Dad shouted, pulling me and Grandpa out. Grandpa was barely conscious, muttering under his breath as we scrambled down the road. The figures moved faster now, their twisted limbs propelling them forward with unnatural speed. Just as they were almost upon us, a blinding light cut through the darkness. A voice rang out, firm and commanding. "Get behind me." We turned to see a man in a clerical collar holding a lantern high. He stood resolute, his other hand clutching a heavy wooden cross. The creatures recoiled at the light, their groans turning to shrieks. "This land is cursed," the pastor said, his voice steady, "but the Lord's light will keep them at bay." He began to chant in Latin, his voice growing louder with each word. The figures writhed, their forms twisting and dissolving into shadows that scattered into the woods. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, replaced by a stillness that felt almost sacred. The pastor turned to us, his face pale but resolute. "You've stirred something ancient," he said. "You must never return to that house. The evil there will only grow stronger." Grandpa passed away in the hospital that night. His final words were a warning. The house won't let go. And he was right. Even now, I can feel its pull in my dreams, beckoning me back to that cursed place. When I came to, the basement was empty. Grandpa was gone, and so was the corpse. Dad and I never spoke of that day again, but we both refused to set foot in that house since. Weeks later, I stumbled across an old town record while searching for answers. It confirmed Grandpa's claim the land beneath his house had indeed been a graveyard, deconsecrated and forgotten long before he purchased the property. Even more chilling were the accounts of previous owners who reported unexplainable phenomena. Flickering lights, whispers in the walls, and shadows moving where no shadows should be. Some nights, I dream of Grandpa's house. I see the cellar door swinging open, hear the groaning of the stairs, and feel the icy grip of something unseen dragging me down. I wake up gasping, the image of that grotesque grin burned into my memory. Whatever happened that day, I know one thing for certain. Some secrets refuse to stay buried, and some places are never meant to be homes. Subscribe to the channel and like the video so you don't miss new videos.